So in today's lecture, I'm getting into the early history of the Roman Empire. That's our main thing we'll, of course, be doing today. And then we'll talk about the rise of Christianity, which does happen at the same time, like around the first century is when it pretty much gets started. So that's pretty much what we, of course, will be covering today. So anyway, yeah, there is a new PowerPoint lecture, which hopefully you've already seen already at this point, which of course is that one right there where it says Roman Empire. We have actually kind of started on already. I believe we had kind of just started talking about Augustus, Caesar Augustus or Emperor Augustus. I think I had mentioned how he became the first emperor last time at the end of the Republic. And we had talked about how, I remember Julius Caesar is the one that kind of ended the Republic, and then his nephew comes in, Octavian, who, of course, the Roman Senate starts calling Augustus. And so he's the one that starts the whole Roman Empire. He's the so-called father of the Roman Empire. So that's basically where we're at from the previous lecture, from that part 2 lecture I did, of course, the other day. So yeah, let me go ahead and first talk. I think we had mentioned about, his reign. Augustus' reign was often referred to as the Age of Augustus. It's about a period of like 41 years, roughly. In fact, it goes from 27 BC to 14 CE, or if you want to use AD, you can as well. And so it's a golden age. It's a period where Roman culture in the empire kind of peaks, especially between the first and the second centuries. And a lot of great writers lived there. Like, I think I told you about Livy and Virgil kind of lived at that time. And so Augustus is kind of like the father of the Roman Empire. He's, kind of like our version of George Washington that kind of creates the state. And there was an old saying about Augustus: when he came to Rome, it was brick. And then when he left, it was marble. So he kind of totally changed the whole, state and all that. Augustus was, of course, known for developing, you may have heard of the Pax Romana. It's very famous. And the Pax Romana is a 200-year period, which means Roman peace. And it's a period where the Roman state, the empire, would peak as a power. Not just, like I said, culturally or whatever, power-wise, but even in size, it would peak. It would peak from about a size of about 2 to 3 million square miles. In fact, it went from like basically the Atlantic, ocean, like where Spain is and part of North Africa, and it went all the way to the east, to where Iraq is. And I think its eastern border was the Tigris River. And at one point, I think they even say it may have reached the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea pretty much at one point. So it was a massive empire. And so 27 BC is about when it starts, when Augustus comes in, and it goes up to 180 CE, which is when you may have heard of Marcus Aurelius. That's when he died. And that's usually the dates they mark it from, pretty much. He, of course, like I said, rebuilt the whole, state pretty much, including not just that, but all the roads and buildings and aqueducts and things like that were all constructed pretty much throughout the empire. Also, he's the one that actually, if you know about this, created the imperial bodyguard of the Roman emperors, that would, of course, come later. That was known as the Praetorian Guard, which was about the size of a Roman legion, like 4,000 or 5,000, soldiers in it. The Praetorian Guard was really powerful. It was basically this political body, a military political body that, in a sense, controlled a lot of the power behind the throne. Usually when an emperor would die, quite often the Praetorian Guard would pretty much be the influence on who would become emperor next. Probably Augustus' only main failure, if you know about this, was he had trouble trying to conquer Germania, which, of course, now called Germany today. He sent some legions in there trying to kind of Romanize that region. But if you know about it, they got wiped out in 9 AD at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. It's called the Varian disaster, named after this guy named Varius that went in there and got killed. And so pretty much after that, the Romans never really conquered Germany. And it later became their nemesis later because, you get later the whole barbarian invasions from Germany that come in later. So that's something that I think they should have done, but they didn't. Now, Augustus had a bunch of successors that came in. They were known as the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. So he formed his own dynasty. And that's what historians call it later, by the way, the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. And it's got 5 rulers in it. It's got, you can't see them all, but there you go. Augustus, of course, the founder, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Claudius is also sometimes called Claudius the First as well. Of course, the names Julio-Claudian. Julio, of course, comes from the name Julian, the Julian family, like Julius, going back to Julius Caesar. That's their family, the Julian family. And then the Claudius family, that 4th one there, I believe it is. He actually not, I think it was Tiberius, I think was the one I thought it was. You kind of married into it. But they have the other so-called Claudian family that married into it that they had also as well. So it's around from about, I don't think I've got the dates there for it, but they reigned from 27 BC and they go up to like 68 CE or AD, which is about a little over 100 years that they're in power. Here's all the relatives we're talking about, of course, going back to Julius Caesar and all that. But Augustus, of course, the founder, you see number 1. Tiberius was the son-in-law. I'll get to him in a second. He actually was a Roman general and married one of Augustus' daughters. I think he's actually the one that's actually related back to the Claudians and all that. But 3 is Caligula, was Tiberius' nephew. Claudius was the uncle of Caligula. And then also Nero, of course, the last one, number 5, was Claudius' grandnephew. Caligula was actually the great-grandson of Augustus. So some of them were kind of directly related back to him and all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and move on from Augustus because we've kind of talked a little bit about him pretty much today. I want to go ahead and talk about Tiberius a little bit. I'm not going to talk about Christianity yet. I know that's on the bottom of that slide, but I'll come back to that first. I want to go ahead and cover the main, the monarchs, the emperors that are part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which they start calling them Caesars, pretty much after that. Tiberius was the 2nd longest reigning emperor in Roman Empire's history. He reigned around 23 years. So it's way longer than, most of the other ones. And Augustus, remember, was like 41 years. So it's pretty amazing. However, he wasn't very popular. When he came in, I think he was a popular general, had been involved in various conquests under Augustus. But after he married Augustus' daughter and was adopted, apparently he started this whole political repression in the Roman state. Tiberius thought there were enemies that were out to get him. In fact, he was actually worried that he was going to get assassinated. And so his Praetorian Guard started arresting different peoples who he thought were a threat to him. And so it led to these so-called treason trials where they put people on trial for various reasons. And a lot of them were either exiled or put to death. There was a guy named, Macro, I think was his name. Yeah, that's correct, Macro. Macro was a famous prefect who was the head of the Praetorian Guard. He actually ran a lot of the treason trials, practically was like a de facto ruler who ruled over Rome. Because Tiberius eventually, I think in the end of his life, actually moved from Rome. He lived on an island called the Isle of Capri off the coast of Naples, in like a castle. It's kind of weird. And so that was another reason he was unpopular, because nobody could see him, So what happened, they think, was that Tiberius died in 37 CE. It's kind of a debate about how he died. Some people think he died of natural causes. Others claim he was poisoned or smothered to death by Caligula, his nephew. But Caligula at number 3 would come in, the 3rd Julio-Claudian emperor, he had a short reign. He only reigned a few years, from 37 to 41. Like I said, Caligula was the great-grandson of Augustus. And in his first few months when he was in power, he was very popular. I think he actually started putting on a lot of games and I think cut taxes and things like that. But apparently he got really ill. And what happened was eventually he came out of a coma. He was actually in a coma, I think, for a couple months. And when he came out, he started going insane. And so Caligula was known for being one of these mad emperors that went crazy and all that. I've got a slide on him too. I got two slides actually for I think Caligula and Claudius, which are right here, and a little bit about his name, which well, we ever studied much about Caligula and all of that, but Caligula had a nickname. They called him Little Boots. It was a name that he got. His father was a Roman general named Germanicus, and they would take his son on campaign with him. And so, well, I think his mother was behind this, but his mother would dress him up like a little soldier. And so the other soldiers started calling him Caligula, which meant little boot or little boots. And so the name stuck. But he didn't like the name. He hated it. And he really preferred to be called Gaius, which I think his full name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Anyway, all this political oppression was like really nutty. Some of the things he was known for. There's all kinds of crazy circulating stories about Caligula. He was known for a lot of, what's the word to use? It was sadistic. Like he would put a lot of people to death during his reign, as an example. A lot of debauchery. Have you ever seen that? Like it's kind of like a soft porn kind of movie called Caligula. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but he was kind of known for that kind of stuff as well. There's bizarre stories too about his horse. He had this horse he had called Incitatus, and he made one time he would give lavish banquets for it, and then there was a story where he got angry because he didn't think there was anybody that could be Roman consul. He said, "Hey, I want my horse to be the consul." And then there was another story about his sister named Drusilla, and they think he actually slept with his sister a few times, and when she died or something before he did, he was really depressed about it. Caligula is known for being one of the first emperors to be murdered, as far as they know. He was actually killed by the Praetorian Guard January 41 CE. And so his death led to his uncle taking over, who became known as either Claudius or Claudius the First, as they called him. And there's a famous story where supposedly Claudius actually thought he was going to get killed. And some soldiers found him hiding in like the palace. He was like hiding behind like a balcony where some curtains were. They pulled him out and said, "Hey, you're emperor now." And so it's kind of interesting about that. So it's kind of showing you how the military, has a lot of control over who becomes the emperor, not the Roman Senate, usually. So then they got Nero, who we've kind of already talked a little bit about because of the Great Fire of Rome, of course, that occurs. And so he comes in. Oh, and not Nero. We forgot about Claudius. I need to go back because I almost passed him up. Oops, Claudius. Yeah, let me first talk a little bit about Claudius, and then I'll move on to talk about Nero a little bit, which is our main guy I want to talk about today, of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Well, Nero, before Nero comes in, Claudius was actually a pretty good emperor. He reigned from about 41 to 54 CE. He's an interesting emperor. He was one of the first Roman emperors to be born outside of Italy, from what is Gaul, which is what they called France in those days. And actually, Claudius was a pretty good emperor. He was considered a very good administrator overall. Wasn't really a military mind or anything like that, I don't think too much, but he was known for the one to be the emperor of the Romans that would start the conquest of Roman Britain, which started in 43 CE. That was the year, 43 CE. the Romans would take something like 40-something years for them to actually conquer most of England up to close to where the Scottish border is overall. And the Romans called Roman Britain, they called it Britannia, I think was the main name they usually called it. And one of the greatest generals that actually fought in, I guess, Britain and eventually conquered most of it was Agricola. He conquered most of the northern part of it, which succeeded by the time of the Flavian Dynasty and all that. Claudius, by the way, was married multiple times, like 4 times, I think is right, overall. His 4th wife was famous, named Agrippina Minor, which minor means the younger. And anyway, she conspired basically to put her own son on the throne, who was named Nero. Nero was the grandnephew of Claudius. Claudius had his own son, by the way, whose name was, I think his name was Britannica, or actually Britannicus. Probably named after Britain, most likely Britannicus. And what happened was they think that Agrippina conspired with Nero to poison Claudius, like kill him, and they also killed his own son, like Britannicus. I think both of them were poisoned so Nero could become the emperor. So that's how Nero, came in and became emperor at that point. Nero was really young when he came to power. It's one of the youngest emperors, I think, so far. You study about Roman history. He came to power, I think, when he was like 16. That's about right. And he reigned from about 54 to 68 CE, about 14 years or so. Of course, he's the last Julio-Claudian dynasty emperor. There's no more after that, and there's none probably related back to Julius Caesar or Augustus. He was also kind of like Caligula and Tiberius. He was kind of a tyrant, kind of mad. His reign was also kind of full of a lot of debauchery. There's all kinds of crazy stories about Nero, which I'm not sure if they're true or not, but there's stories where he would actually go visit the brothels, or he would go out and get drunk like just average Romans. Or there's one story where he would actually dress up in disguise and go out and mug people on the street. It's crazy stuff. Oh, and he thought he was a musician, about this. He would have recitals where he would force people to listen to him play like the lyre, and do performances. And a lot of people couldn't leave. If you left, they would kill you, basically. So he was known for killing his mother, matricide, I guess they called it, on 59 CE. He was worried about his mother having too much power, Agrippina, the younger, so he had her killed, basically. So he's kind of a sadistic ruler, Nero, but some of the stuff about it might be exaggerated about some of the things that may have actually happened. Now, Nero became famous, like you saw in the video, about the Great Fire of Rome. It's considered one of the greatest disasters that hit Rome. There's been at least 3 major fires I know they've had over Roman times. It's been a few. And I think there was one under the Flavian Dynasty they had, and they had one under Commodus. There was another fire. But this one was the worst. This one burned out over 80% of the main districts. Like 10 out of 14 were pretty much burned out and had to be rebuilt, of course, later, which a lot of construction actually happened under the Flavian Dynasty later. So it's considered one of their greatest disasters. And it killed hundreds of people, but they're not sure the exact numbers on how many people actually died. But they kept records back there for that. But they do think that it created a lot of homeless people. And so Nero got kind of blamed for it. He was kind of like the scapegoat for why the fire broke out, which they think it was likely an accident, which broke out in the Circus Maximus, which is their main, where they have the chariot racing in Rome and all that. But he got blamed for it. And eventually what happened was people started kind of talking about this. And even some of the Roman historians kind of mention about that. Suetonius and I think Cassius Dio think he did it on purpose, like burned out parts of the city so he could build his own lavish palace Here's a picture of Nero right here. But there's actually this palace here called it's called the Golden House. It had this golden roof to it that he built. And some people think that he kind of built that right after the fire on purpose because of the fact that he maybe had burned it out, which were mostly slums. They were slum areas. They were right there. And so he began construction afterwards. And so a lot of people thought maybe he was behind it and burned them out. And they don't really know for sure exactly because I think the historians are kind of divided on, who actually did it. Tacitus, who's the greatest, Roman historian they ever had, said he didn't do it. So they in fact, they say he wasn't even there, wasn't even in Rome and all that when the fire actually happened. But of course, the story about, Nero is that he basically played the lyre and sang the sack of Troy as the city burnt. And it's kind of a legend about that, but it's likely not true about that. However, because of the criticism toward him, what happened was Nero instead began to blame the Christians for the fire because of that. And so that's what Nero's mostly famous for as an emperor. He's basically the first emperor to really openly persecute the Christians as a new religious sect that was kind of developing at that point that followed, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. And so there's even historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, the main ones, I guess, they talk about back in Roman times, that actually wrote about it. That talk about the persecutions. And they describe kind of like how they were put to death mostly. A lot of them were crucified. There were cases where some were burned to death. And some were even taken and they were thrown to wild animals to be basically eaten alive. So pretty vicious Nero. And they think that's part of why Nero's reign kind of declined at that point. And so his unpopularity kind of led to his demise. And over time, it caused the civil war to break out among his armies. Like the Roman armies got sick of him too. And so his generals started revolting. They started declaring themselves the emperor over him instead. And even the Senate got involved. The Roman Senate decided that they'd had enough of him too. And he was declared an outlaw. And so they tried to hunt him down, but if you know about it, Nero killed himself is what ended up happening. And so that's pretty much how his whole reign ended at that point. So that was pretty much the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, pretty much overall. And I'll get to it later, but the dynasty that takes over afterwards will be called the Flavian Dynasty. It's only got 3 emperors in it. It's founded by this Roman general named Flavius Vespasian, and I'll get to him later about that. Now, I need to get into, of course, and talk about also the rise of Christianity, because that's something else that happens too. Let me go back up here, because I didn't really get into that about the rise of Christianity, which is an important thing that happens at about the same time as the Julio-Claudian dynasty is in overall. And the first century is basically where Christianity starts. It starts in the eastern part of the empire where Israel is today. It's actually an area that was actually 2 provinces that the Romans actually occupied, which was Judea, which is in the south, which was mostly central southern Israel around Jerusalem, and then Galilee, which was in the northern part of Israel, probably part of Lebanon. And they believe that Christianity, of course, was founded by, the teachings of basically Jesus of Nazareth, who Jesus was believed to be this Jewish preacher. Sometimes they say rabbi. He was a Jewish preacher of some type. They think was actually a carpenter who came from Galilee, like this little town of Nazareth or village. And Christians, of course, think that Jesus was seen as the Messiah. That's in the Old Testament, the Son of God, the Christian Messiah, which the term they use is Christos, which means Greek Messiah. And the early life of Jesus is mostly gotten from various sources, which of course are in the New Testament. The main ones, of course, the most important ones are the 2 gospel accounts, Matthew and Luke. They have also Mark and John, but those two are really probably the most important ones that talk about the early life of Jesus. They go into like his virgin birth, was supposedly Mary, Virgin Mary, and raised by Mary and his father Joseph. So a lot of the early traditions of Jesus pretty much gotten from that. The early aspects of his birth date, that's kind of disputed today. They're not sure. They always put it at 1 CE or 1 AD, either one. But the birth date kind of jumps around. I think it's like anywhere from like 6. What is the dates for that? I always forget what it is, but I think it's 6 AD to 4 BC, and somewhere in that range on average. So they average it out as being 1 CE. They start the Christian era after that, pretty much. It's not too much known about Jesus' life, like after he's born, until he gets baptized by John the Baptist, and he's kind of starting his own ministry at that point. And they do think that his ministry was very short. As a preacher in Israel, he's only probably did this for about 3 years. I think the popular dates I've got there is 30 to 33 CE, with 33 possibly being the popular year when he may have been crucified. Anyway, they think this all happened under the period of Tiberius' reign. So if you read the Bible where it says Caesar and all that, they're talking about Emperor Tiberius. In 33 CE, they think he was arrested after the Last Supper, where he had met with his main apostles and all that. And they think that Jesus was actually brought up on charges which were actually blasphemy, because he claimed to be the Messiah and the Son of God. And of course, a lot of Jews didn't think he was, except his followers. And so that led to a series of trials that kind of went back and forth between the Jewish and Roman authorities in Israel and Judea at the time. And of course, his fate was eventually decided by the prefect of Judea that ran the Judean state, which was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was actually this politician that had been put in power by Tiberius. I think he was in power for like 26 to 36 CE. They think he was a real guy, Pontius Pilate. He's the one that eventually decided Jesus' fate to be crucified, but he thought he was innocent. You know that. Anyway, I've got some slides here, of course, later if you want to look at them later if you want, which are right here. So more about Jesus. It's more like northern Israel or Palestine to be where it would be, of course. Now, Christianity would spread, though, after Jesus was crucified and resurrected. Of course, as you know, what happened was supposedly Jesus, after he resurrected, they had the so-called Great Commission happen. I don't know if you know about this, but he told basically his main apostles, the 12 apostles of Jesus, which was his main disciples, to spread his message, the gospel throughout, the Roman world. And so in 33 CE, that's what they did. 30 CE, they started doing this. And of course, as you know, the whole thing spread over like a period of like 70, 80 years or so. Really, the peak of it is usually from about 33 to about 100 CE. Christianity would spread throughout most of the Roman world. It usually goes up to about close to 100, because that's when they think St. John the Baptist died, more or less. And they call that period the apostolic age, like 70-something years or so, around 70 years. And so it spreads pretty much from Israel to, Greece, Turkey, Italy, Spain, Britain, France, North Africa, etc., Syria. And there are a lot of different apostles that, of course, were involved in trying to spread Christianity. Of course, those are probably the ones that are the most famous, I would say. Of course, Peter, probably the most famous disciple of Jesus, was later known as either Simon Peter, or of course they called him Saint Peter. And Peter, would end up being later on seen as the first bishop of Rome. He's basically what we call the first pope to the Catholic Church. So he's pretty vital. Also, St. John the Baptist was also big. He was one of the 12 apostles too, like Peter. He wrote the Gospel of John. They believe it's attributed to him anyway. Epistles of John, and then they think he's the one that wrote the book of Revelation. Also, St. James the Greater was also important. He was actually the brother of John the Baptist. So he was another one that was also very well known. He's one that St. James Parish is named after, Louisiana, of course. Also, it's known as the son of Zebedee. Also, St. James the Lesser. They had two St. James, which is kind of confusing. The others are like Matthew, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Simon, Thomas, Thaddeus, and of course Judas. That was one of the ones that betrayed Jesus. Paul of Tarsus, of course, was another, of course, famous apostle. He didn't really know Jesus, but if you know about Paul, who was originally called Saul of Tarsus, who came from Turkey, he was this Jew that converted to Christianity after he had started persecuting Christians. And he later went on to actually spread Christianity the most. He was really the most influential apostle of the first century. And he was later called the apostle to the Gentiles because Paul really concentrated on trying to spread the religion to non-Jews because originally Christianity had started out as really like a form of Judaism. They kind of broke off. Of course, the gospel accounts, which were eventually written down, were basically the stories about the life, of Jesus, his ministry, his trial, death, and resurrection, and all that. And the name gospel is a Greek word that means good news. I think it was oral originally. At least that's the tradition of how it kind of got passed down. And then over time, they think they started writing it down. There's kind of a debate about what they first wrote it in, like language-wise. But they think some theorize they may have written it originally in Hebrew or Aramaic, but eventually they're translated into Greek. And that's the ones that survive. And there's like four main gospels that become the main church canon. A lot of Christian churches later, like the Catholic and Orthodox churches, that's Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. The first three are often called the synoptic gospels because they're kind of related to each other, similar. Although Mark, they think, is older than Matthew and Luke. So that's the theory of what the order is when they were written. So Mark written first, then Matthew and Luke, and then John. There's also apocrypha gospels, which were rejected by the various churches. But there are other gospels out there that were circulating, but those are deemed to be the ones that are the closest to the originals because the original gospels don't exist anymore. Now, the New Testament itself was not compiled till later. In fact, it's not till the time of Constantine the Great when they actually compiled the actual New Testament, like all the books together. Of course, besides the four main Gospels, Acts, of course, is put in there next. Epistles of Paul, 7 general epistles, and then, of course, the book of Revelation is in the back. They think the epistles of Paul is pretty old, too. They might even predate some of them before the Gospels were written down. Now, over time, Christianity split up. It didn't stay together. You know about this, and pretty much is like this later. And Christianity in the first century split into two main groups. You had the so-called Jewish Christians. Jewish Christians were, of course, the founders of the Christian religion originally, which were only like a few thousand. I think that may have been in it originally. There weren't that many in it, believe it or not. And then the other group was the Roman Christians. These were people that were basically not Jewish. They were called Gentiles. Gentile is like a non-Jewish person. And so they're often called Roman Gentiles or Roman Christians. And most of them converted from like paganism or some kind of pagan religion and became Christian. Also, another thing too about the Jewish Christians, there were different sects. It's kind of weird, but they had different subgroups that they had. But the ones that started the original religion, like related to Jesus and all that, were called the Nazarenes, from the name Nazareth. And these were like the followers of Jesus that kind of continued the religion, especially at Israel. And one of the big leaders of it was James the Just. He was like a brother or half brother of Jesus that kind of kept it going. Another one that broke away was called the Ebionites, which was a Greek word meaning the poor ones. And the Ebionites was this type of Christian religion early on that practiced a type of religion which was based on living in poverty. That's what I meant, poor ones. And they believed that one of the keys to salvation was to not have a lot of material things. But they think that the Roman Christians, though, themselves, like the Gentile ones, were heavily influenced by Paul, like St. Paul, and probably Peter, too, as well. But Paul was the biggest influence in getting a lot of them to convert in his form of Christianity. That would, of course, develop later overall. Another thing that caused the split, too, there was a deal where they eventually have this ecumenical council that met in 50 CE called the Council of Jerusalem. Ecumenical council was a type of like clerical council. And Paul, Peter, and James the Just, one of the brothers of Jesus, met in Jerusalem. And they met there to decide if the Gentiles, like non-Jews, should be allowed to become Christians. This is a big deal if you know about this. And the Jewish Christians didn't want to let them in because they didn't want to follow like Jewish traditions, like Mosaic law, circumcision, and all that. And if you know what happened, Paul basically rejected all that. He went against circumcision. Most Romans thought circumcision was barbaric, by the way. And they also didn't want to follow Mosaic law because Paul believed that Mosaic law had been superseded by Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount and all that. And so it was a major issue later that would split the Jews and the Christians up. And most Jews would reject the ideas of Jesus and all that, and they would separate over time. There's other things that also caused the split between the Jews and the Christians over time as well. What happened, if you know about it, was the Jewish Christians eventually got wiped out. Most of their leaders disappeared over time. A lot of it was caused by the Jewish-Roman wars that were fought between the first and the second century. That led to the so-called Great Diaspora, where the Jews were dispersed throughout the Mediterranean world, which I think I may have talked about before. Anyway, the Second Temple was destroyed, and a lot of the Jewish Christian leaders were kind of, involved with that temple. And when it was destroyed, that pretty much led to a lot of the demise of a lot of the leaders that were part of that. Also, at the bottom there, I don't know if you see that right there, but you see that's where it says Fiscus Judicus. That was something they think that also helped to separate Jews from Christians later. And it's called the Jewish tax. And later under the Romans, I think it was under the Flavian Dynasty, if you were Jewish, you had to pay a tax. And so that meant that a lot of these people that were Christians didn't want to get labeled as being like the Jews. And so they started kind of separating as a different sect and all that. Finally, in the Middle Ages, what happened was Christianity split into two permanent medieval churches, of course, which you've heard about. And the one in the West was called the Roman Catholic Church. It kind of was a remnant of the Western Roman Empire, eventually based in Italy with the Pope. And then the Greek Orthodox Church, or called Orthodox Christianity, broke away from the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire later, they called it. And it was based in Constantinople. So you have these two separate churches that kind of break apart at that point. And the one in Constantinople was ruled by a patriarch, but both were actually bishops. Like the ruler of the actual clergy guy that ran the Orthodox Church was called the patriarch of, actually called the bishop of Constantinople. They call him a patriarch. And then the one that was the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. So they kind of separated. All right, let me go ahead and move on, and I need to get into, because I will be coming back later to talk about, early Christianity and all that, but I want to get in next and talk a few minutes about the Flavian Dynasty that comes in, that's well known for this period. And the Flavian Dynasty was a dynasty I mentioned earlier that was founded by a general of Nero named Vespasian. They call him Flavius Vespasian. And he seized power after a civil war. There was a civil war between 68 to about 69 CE that lasted about a year and a half. He had several actual generals try to seize power at one point. And anyway, so he came to power and eventually took over. And he formed his own dynasty, which became known, you see there, as called the Flavian Dynasty. It's named after his name, Flavius or Flavian. And he reigned 10 years, and in the dynasty itself reigned less than really 30 years, about 27 years, roughly. There are only 3 emperors in it. You can see there Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Interesting reign of this dynasty, because it's really considered to be one of the first imperial Rome, dynasties that has a deal where the sons actually succeed the father. That's something that's actually rare. You don't see that much in Roman history with the empire. Most emperors are not chosen like from their father, like hereditary or anything like that. This case has happened actually twice in a row with Titus and Domitian coming in, who are brothers. They're real brothers, and sons of the actual, Vespasian. And I think I've got some pictures if you want to look at of Vespasian, which is, I'll show it right here. There's the 3 right there. So Vespasian's on the far left. You've got Titus in the middle, and then you got Domitian to the right, which is right there. Let me go ahead and first talk about Vespasian a little bit. Here's, of course, a little PowerPoint slide on that. Now, Vespasian was actually more known for his military exploits before he actually became emperor. He came from the equestrian background, which is kind of like the upper middle class between the patricians and plebes. And he became famous for fighting in the First Jewish-Roman War, which has all kinds of names. They call it the Great Jewish War or Jewish Revolt. And what happened was in 66 CE, the Jews in where Israel is revolted. They didn't want to be under Roman rule anymore. They wanted to have their own separate state. And so the Romans had to put it down. In fact, they sent several legions in there, and they got wiped out by the Jews. It wasn't looking good. And so that's why they sent Vespasian in there. And when the war was going on, he became emperor in 69 CE. And so he sent his son in there to take care of it. He was also a Roman general too, which was Titus. And Titus is the one that actually finished the war. He sacked Jerusalem and took it. And he actually destroyed the second temple of Jerusalem, which not much is left there today, except the western wall, which the Jews now call the Wailing Wall. So the temple was destroyed, they think, in 70 CE. That's what led actually to the so-called, at least it started at that point between the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Romans start kicking the Jews out of Israel. You know about this so-called Great Diaspora. All the Jews, of course, are forced to eventually leave and go live throughout the Roman Empire, like throughout the Mediterranean region over time. So that's something that the Romans were known for, and the Romans didn't like the Jews. They hated them. It's kind of ironic that they became Christians later, because Jesus was a Jew, but the Romans hated the Jews. They couldn't stand them and fought numerous wars against them. Now, one thing that is very famous about Vespasian that's well known, Vespasian is the one that built the Roman Colosseum that you know is in Rome now, which, of course, probably the most famous building that was ever built there a long time ago. And anyway, under Vespasian, it was constructed over something like 10 years during his reign. I think it was actually completed by Titus, who came in after he died. And yes, it was built by slaves. Just about everything you see in the Roman world was constructed by slaves: roads, bridges, buildings, etc. I think the only thing that wasn't was Hadrian's Wall or something like that. But yeah, Jewish slaves actually built the Roman Colosseum. And that's not what its name originally was. That's the name that everybody started calling it later. It was actually called the Amphitheatrum Flavianum. When it first opened, they started calling it that. But apparently there was a nearby statue of Nero called the Colosseum of Nero that was nearby where it was built. And so people started calling it Colosseum, named after the actual statue, and the name basically stuck. And it's basically like a football stadium today. It would be kind of like the prototype to a lot of your football and soccer stadiums that are well known today. And it varied on the seating capacity, but they think it maybe at least 60,000 maybe could sit in it, maybe knee to knee or something like that, or maybe more than that. But they do think it opened in the year 81 CE, which Titus opened the first public games originally. Of course, it was used for mass entertainment. I think the term they used for it all the time was bread and circus. To basically entertainment was used to pacify the public population. It's kind of what they do today, Anyway, they had all kinds of events that they would put on. Usually in the mornings, they would have wild beast hunts where they would bring in exotic animals from all over the empire, and people would go in and kill them. They would put on plays. Sometimes they would have a play and someone would die. They really died. Gladiatorial events, of course, were the big things where gladiators would fight each other and things like that. It wasn't always to the death, I think, like some people claim and all that. But there is a story where they tell, which is kind of might be true as far as they can tell from archaeology. But there's a theory that they may have flooded the whole thing with water and held these mock naval battles. I think it was called Naumachia or something like that. They dubbed it. And I don't know, they may have done those a couple times, which is kind of unique. Also, they would execute people, like bring in POWs, Christians, and other people and put them to death. And so a lot of people died in the Colosseum. There's probably a lot of ghosts running around there. I think if I remember correctly, they think maybe 500,000 or more people may have actually died in the Colosseum. And it was actually open until the 6th century CE. It was actually being used. But I think later they kind of banned some of the bloodletting, all that later when Rome became Christian and so on. Oh, I will mention about the Circus Maximum at it, which is another thing they had for entertainment as well. That was the famous racetrack in Rome, where they had chariot racing, and it could seat way more, like 4 times probably the actual seating as the Colosseum. Maybe 250,000 maybe could watch chariot racing. And the Byzantine Empire later had a version of that, which was called the Hippodrome. A little smaller version of it, but they had something similar to it. Now, Vespasian died of natural causes eventually, and so what happened next, Emperor Titus came in. So he came in next as emperor, the guy in the middle, which is right here. Let me talk a little about Titus. Not too much happened under Titus. Titus was more known for his military exploits, like sacking Jerusalem. They even built the Arch of Titus, which was also kind of built by Jews too as well. And he only reigned for a little over 2 years, from 79 to 81 CE, but he was actually popular. And like I said, Titus was the first emperor to succeed his father, which nobody had ever done before, like official son. If you know much about his reign, the thing that really stands out the most that's well known is they had a volcano blow up, which is kind of funny. Not really, but it did happen. And of course, Mount Vesuvius, of course, famously erupted during his reign. It's probably one of the most famous natural catastrophes to hit the Roman Empire. And Mount Vesuvius is a volcano on the western part of Italy, in southern Italy near Naples. And it erupted on August 24th, 79 CE. It was considered, by the way, one of the worst volcanic eruptions in history. And I think they say the power of the actual eruption was equivalent to something like 100,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, the first atom bomb. And all that's how bad it was. And the amount of debris that it put into the sky, like you're looking at there, was a lot, and enough to pretty much bury a lot of cities that were nearby, with the worst two, Herculaneum, and also the famous one, of course, of Pompeii, were all buried by volcanic ash and debris, lava also as well. And it killed thousands of people. They seem to think that it maybe, I think they say 16,000 may have died, but somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people were likely died from it. And of course, it made a lot of people refugees because it wiped out a lot of these cities, which had to be rebuilt later and all of this. And what's interesting about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, it was actually the first volcanic eruption that was actually written about. And there was a writer named Pliny the Younger, who was, I think, a poet and a writer and some kind of administrator under the Roman government. But he actually wrote about it and actually sent a letter to Tacitus about it, describing it. And so that's why we kind of know about what happened. I think his father died, and his name was Pliny the Elder. He didn't make it. And so a lot of people didn't make it out that lived there. And Pompeii was kind of this rich, wealthy resort city that kind of got destroyed. So that's kind of what about Pompeii. And I do have pictures showing like the ruins of it, which today, if you know about Pompeii, it's kind of like this time capsule that was kind of buried by the actual debris and all that. There's, of course, a Roman street. So it would look like, here's this amphitheater. So a lot of it was kind of preserved, by the volcanic eruption. So you can see the volcano in the background, which is dormant now. But actually, it's really weird, but it actually erupted in World War II in 1944. That's the last time it's actually erupted. So it may or may not come back. We have to interesting to see about that later, about what actually happens. All right, so let me get into next and talk about, also they have one more, I forgot about one more we got to talk about. You also have, don't forget, Domitian. Domitian was another emperor that was very famous, of course, that was under the Flavians. He came next. And he, of course, basically was Titus's brother. He would reign actually the longest for 15 years. He was kind of tyrannical compared to his brother, but he was actually a pretty good administrator. He's the one that rebuilt a lot of the city because there was another fire that broke out apparently under Titus that happened. And so he had to reconstruct the city again. I think he built something like 50 buildings or more. And he was very ruthless towards a lot of different people. Like he sent the senators, a lot of them he had either imprisoned or killed under him. He also persecuted a lot of Christians under him, and also Jews. And he censored a lot of writings under him, like Christians' writings and things like that were actually banned at one point under him. They think it's under him that Britain was finally conquered, most of it up like Scotland. He was eventually killed, and what happened was the Praetorian Guard and the Senate conspired to basically overthrow him. And so he was murdered in 96 CE. And so with his death, what happened was the Flavian Dynasty ended. And what happened was they put in a bunch of new emperors that come in that are known as the period of the five good emperors, which range from about 96 to about 180 CE, 80, 90 years. And it's considered to be one of the peak periods of the Pax Romana, when you got some of the best emperors that actually reigned. And it's actually two dynasties, not one. It's one called the Nerva Dynasty and another one called the Antonine Dynasty. And Machiavelli was the one that coined the term like a long time ago. He called them the 5 good emperors, is what he called it, because they had 5 good ones in a row. And the Senate actually got along with them, which is something that's kind of rare at that time. And those are the 5 that were in it. You had Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian. They were part of the Nerva dynasty. Then they have Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius was the other 2. They also had another emperor you'll get to later called Commodus. And they're all part of this dynasty called the Antonine Dynasty. So it was actually made up of 2 dynasties that were at the time that were, of course, well known. And this is around the 2nd century that we're talking about. Let me do a little review today because we haven't really done anything with that yet with this period. So let me go back, of course, and talk about the Roman period when the empire began. What does Octavian do after consolidating sole power over Rome? What name is he called afterwards? Octavian, of course, became the first Roman emperor. They called him Caesar Augustus or Emperor Augustus. And the title he preferred was Princeps or Princeps Civitatis. Princeps is usually the popular one, which means first citizen. So he hated Augustus, but everybody starts calling him that later. What was the age of Augustus? What era of Roman peace begins under his reign? The age of Augustus is about a period of like 41 years when he reigns. And it's also considered like the peak period of the Roman Empire. And it's part of the Pax Romana. That's the period he began. He began the period of Roman peace, which is a 200-year period when Roman reached his peak, the empire, from about 27 BC to 180 CE. Who were some historians that wrote about his early reign? You had, of course, the most famous was Tacitus, who wrote a series of books like the Annals of Rome, the Histories of Rome. They had Suetonius, who wrote the 12 Caesars. Now, I think I told you they had Cassius Dio, or sometimes called Dio Cassius, who wrote a book called Roman History. Praetorian Guard was basically the imperial guard of the Roman emperors that protected them and their families. What dynasty was founded by Augustus? Who were the emperors in it? Augustus, of course, it was called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and it had Augustus, the founder, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. What were these emperors famous for? Tiberius was basically Augustus's son-in-law, adopted son. He was a general. He was known for being a tyrannical ruler under his reign. He was unpopular, the second ruler. Caligula was the nephew of Tiberius, the one they called Little Boots. He was the one that went insane, and he only reigned for like 3 or 4 years. He was actually murdered. Claudius was his uncle. Claudius, of course, was actually a pretty good emperor. He was the second best emperor of the Julio-Claudians. He was, of course, born originally in Gaul. And he was the one I told you that actually started conquering Britain. He was, of course, they think murdered too by his wife Agrippina. And so Nero came in. Nero was the grandnephew of Claudius. Nero was known for being a tyrannical ruler too, sadistic, etc. as well. He was the one, of course, that killed his mother. But the more important thing he was known for is 2 things big about Nero. One is that Nero was the one they think that was somehow involved in the Great Fire of Rome, which some people blamed him for, which happened in the year 64. And then Nero was also the first Roman emperor to persecute the Christians, which he did pretty openly. Jesus now was seen as like the founder of Christianity because it was based off of his teachings and his life, like in the New Testament. Jesus was believed to be some kind of Jewish preacher or rabbi that lived in Israel. What governor in Judea put him to death via crucifixion? That was Pontius Pilate. What was the apostolic age? The apostolic age was that period after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, from about 33 to about 100. And that's where the apostles of Jesus spread Christianity throughout the empire, like in the first century. Who was the famous apostles of Jesus? Of course, the most famous was Peter, Simon Peter, who was called St. Peter. They also had St. John the Baptist. And also, I told you about St. James, of course, the greater. It's probably the other one. Those probably three big ones right there that knew Jesus. Why was Paul of Tarsus important to early Christianity? Later called St. Paul. Paul, of course, was known for being the one that spread Christianity throughout the empire. He formed a lot of early churches where he got like non-Jews to join it. And so Paul was known as the apostle to the Gentiles. He spread to non-Jews. What are the four gospel accounts in the New Testament they canonized later? That would be, of course, Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. What two main Christian sects emerged in the first century BC? What happened was Christianity broke into two main sects. You had those that were Jewish Christians. They were the original founders, like the Nazarenes. Ebionites, too, kind of broke off. And then you had also the, what we call the Roman Christians, which are called Gentile Christians. And these were Christians that were pagans that converted to Christianity. What caused the split over time? I told you about the Council of Jerusalem was one thing that kind of split them apart in 50 CE because they couldn't agree on like if they should follow the Mosaic law or not. And Paul said he didn't want to do that, and so they didn't follow Mosaic law and circumcision and all that. Also, I told you about the fact that the temple was destroyed in 70 CE during the Jewish-Roman wars, which that killed off a lot of the leaders of it. And they had a Jewish tax, which Christians didn't want to be part of. Then it split it's in the Middle Age, they split up. They split into two rival churches, which is the Catholic Church in the West, in Western Roman Empire, Roman Catholic Church, and then the Orthodox Church in the East, which was based in Constantinople. And it's called all kinds of names, Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox, but those two would split apart and never get back together. Who took over and founded the Flavian Dynasty? That kind of came in after the Julio-Claudian one collapsed. That was, of course, Vespasian, who was a Roman general under Nero, and included his two sons, Titus and Domitian, who only had three rulers. What famous war broke out in 66 AD under Emperor Nero in the region of Judea? It was called the First Jewish-Roman War, which lasted until 73 CE. And the two generals that put it down were Vespasian, and then he left and became emperor, and his son Titus finished it. He sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE. What famous building did Vespasian build? The Roman Colosseum in Rome. What was ever Titus known for? Titus was mostly known for his military exploits. He was the one that sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE and destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. He also is the one that opened the Colosseum, that in 81. But Titus is more known for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which happened at the beginning of his reign in the year 79, which destroyed like Pompeii, etc. Who was his brother that was overthrown due to his tyrannical rule? That was, of course, the Emperor Domitian. So he was killed. All right, I've got a couple minutes left, not much. Let me just talk about one more thing, and that's it about this period. Did want to talk about just the founder, the guy that started the Nerva dynasty. His name was Nerva. His real name was Marcus Nerva, who reigned from 96 to 98. He was actually a Roman senator that was an advisor to Domitian. And what happened was when he came in, the Senate put him in power because they were worried about, I guess, chaos, ensuing at that point. And so he would come in and rule for about 2 years. And Nerva's important. The reason why Nerva is such a big deal is because Nerva is the one that started this new tradition where they would adopt successors to the throne. And so all the emperors of the period of the five good emperors are often known as the adoptive emperors, is kind of something that they called. And so he adopts Marcus Trajan, who's a Roman general, at that time and starts this new kind of tradition. And so all these other emperors that come in later are kind of picked that way, more or less, more than anything. So I'm going to get more into some of these emperors later that, of course, develop. I think that's pretty much it lecture-wise today for part 3 on, of course, the Romans and the Roman Empire. And I do want to talk about a few things before I go. You do have, of course, like I said, those assignments you still got up. Don't forget about them, but you still got them there, of course, to do overall. And I'm actually going to have a new assignment next week. I got one more quiz to give you left, which is on the early Roman history. You're probably going to see that later in quizzes, but I do have one more quiz I need to give you before the final, because I don't want to give you all this material for the actual exam. I was hoping to give like just the final on the Roman Empire we're doing right now, and then maybe the Middle Ages, and that's probably going to be it for y'all's final later. But don't forget, you've got the India quiz to do over the weekend, and then the second exam is due early next week, so you need to get that worked on. Then don't forget about your vocab. That second vocab is also due. I actually have already put up the final one. The final vocab's already been posted in assignments due at the end of the semester. There's only going to be 3 of them. But that's it for today. I'll see y'all next week, which I'll continue with the Roman Empire. I think on Monday I'll try to finish most of the Roman Empire, but I probably won't finish. But I'll probably I know on Wednesday next week I'll be starting on the Middle Ages. So that's it for today. Y'all take care and have a good weekend.